we will begin. Oh, just a few more people to log on. Okay. So this webinar is originating from the city of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Some speakers will also be presenting from other locations, and we respectfully acknowledge those traditional territories. Hello, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sophie King. I am the manager of professional learning at PIBC, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the third Peer Learning Network webinar on housing affordability. I just wanted to give a shout out to Kristen Agnello for organizing these webinars and doing such a fantastic job. Thank you, Kristen. Today we are pleased to welcome Katy, Fabris, and Kaela Schramm, both from Macola Development Services, and Katy Dakus, a lawyer with Lidstone and Company. Thank you to Lidstone and Company for supporting this PLN webinar initiative. They presented for the first webinar as well. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to both the recording and the slide presentation will be emailed to you shortly. Give me a moment to log on. About 30 people that are waiting to get on. All right. It's a very popular webinar. So a word about the Q&A. Following all the presentations, we will engage in a moderated Q&A session focused on the new provincial legislation and housing affordability. We have asked everyone to pre-submit a couple of questions that were forwarded to all the speakers. And as I was looking through their presentations, I noticed that they have indeed answered a lot of the questions that were asked. However, we do have a few more that just came in, and we will concentrate on those questions. Okay, logging in a few more people here. And I think we're ready to begin. We will begin our program first with a presentation by Katy Dakus. And I'll bring up her presentation. Before Katy begins, however, we do have a word from our president, the President's Minute, Emily Adden. Emily, there you go. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, good afternoon, Sophie, and hello to all of the participants. I just wanted to update you on three things. This is my regular President's Minute at the beginning of all of our PIBC webinars. So one thing, it's quite interesting, really, that our housing issue for Planning West magazine has come out, and we're doing something quite different this time. It's not just available to our members and public subscribers, but it's available free of charge. So that is to be shared with all of you who are interested in this subject, whether or not you're members of the Institute. Also, I would suggest to check out the PIBC Peer Learning Network Forum that's available online. And what you can actually do is bookmark that page. Or another thing you can do is sign up for having the digest sent directly to your email inbox. And then the last thing I wanted to mention in my minute is, did you know that next month marks the 65th anniversary of the Planning Institute of British Columbia registering as a nonprofit society? So that's coming up soon, the full seniors discount. And so I just want to finish off on that note, and back to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Emily. You can get the full seniors discount at Shoppers at 55, just so everyone knows. Thank you, Emily. And now I invite Katy Dakus to turn on her webcam and mic. Hello, Katy.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Sophie.
You're welcome.
I will take it away. Thank you for that introduction, Sophie, and for inviting me to present at today's webinar. As you are aware, my name is Katy, and I'm a municipal lawyer at Lidstone & Company, located in downtown Vancouver. I would like to also acknowledge that as I'm presenting in Vancouver, I am joining you today on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So, as a lawyer, for the next 30 minutes, you all get to be part of every lawyer's favorite activity, a long, unending monologue about the law. I will try and keep it high level and not too boring. So, as the title card may have given away, the focus of my presentation today is on Bill 16, or the Housing Statutes Amendment Act. As I am the first presenter, my goal is to provide you with a clear overview of the legislation and its impacts on both local government powers and authorities. I also figured that if I started with the most boring and dry topics, it will make the rest of the afternoon fly by. So returning to the roadmap I have on the screen, it should now be on the screen. I have divided my presentation into two parts. First, I will provide a summary of the legislative changes made to Bill 16 and outline the new powers it provides to local governments. Second, I will provide some more time detailing the new options available to local governments to adopt inclusionary zoning bylaws, including how local governments may use the carrot or the stick approach to increase affordable and special needs housing in their communities. So, as you can see, Bill 16 amended a number of statutes that impact local governments, namely the Community Charter, the Local Government Act, the Vancouver Charter, and the Islands Trust Act. I do note for the purposes of today's presentation, I am just focusing on the changes made to the Community Charter and the LGA. So by amending these various statutes, you can see that Bill 16 has introduced 5 areas or realms of change. I note that there is, practically speaking, quite a bit of overlap between some of these areas, but I've tried to deal with each in isolation first to better outline their distinct powers, and then we will grapple with how they interrelate. Also, during my presentation, you will hear me reference that some of these powers are subject to regulations. Just to get ahead of the question now, the province has not yet adopted any regulations under Bill 16. So, if there are additional requirements that will be prescribed by regulations, just be aware that those will come down the pipe at a later date. So, before we dive into each of those 5 realms that I mentioned, I wanted to flag that Bill 16 has introduced a couple of new terms. I would say that these terms are all defined in the legislation, but some of the definitions are quite loose. For example, they're implied by the rest of the legislation, or they cross-reference other provisions in the Act. I won't define these definitions in detail quite yet. I just wanted you to be aware that they are here, they are new, and as we come across them in the rest of my discussions, I will define them for you. So don't be alarmed if there's a word on the screen and you don't know what it means. So the first realm I will discuss is the expanded powers granted to local governments that allow them to require works and services from a developing landowner. Be forewarned that this slide and the next one are the most dense and legal based, but the only way out is through. So before Bill 16, local governments could require, I've lost my slide. There we go. Before Bill 16, local governments could require certain works and services as a condition of subdivision. Now, local governments may require works and services as either a condition of subdivision or a condition of development of land. As for the timing, the owner must provide these works and services prior to subdivision approval as a condition or prior to the issuance of the building permit. In terms of the scope of the power, the Act sets out that a local government may regulate, require, and prescribe minimum standards for the construction, provision, and location of a wide variety of works and services. As for the types of works and services, I have broken these down into 4 main categories: highway requirements, system requirements, amenity requirements, and transport infrastructure requirements. But I would recommend checking out Bill 16 to see the full list. You can find that in Bill 16 under Section 506 of the Local Government Act. What I think is interesting about this list is the sheer scope of amenities that are named in the Act and that can be required as a condition of development of land. I have a partial list on the screen, but I did want to read out a more comprehensive list just to give a better idea of the scope. So we have boulevard crossings, streetlights, transit bays, underground wiring, and amenities, which includes bollards, bicycle parking, benches, directional signing, street lamps, street signs, transit shelters, waste disposal, and recycling containers. I also note that this is not a closed list and that there may be amenities that a local government can require that are not captured by this list. In addition to all those amenities, it's also interesting to see the reframing of transit from simply being dedicated highway to a broader and greener transport options. This is something I'll touch on more in the next realm of change, but I wanted to flag at this point that the legislation defines transport infrastructure as including infrastructure for walking, cycling, and public transit, and authorizes that local governments can require developers to provide as part of their development both traffic calming mechanisms and sustainable design measures aimed at reducing emissions and promoting climate resilience. Although these powers are quite broadened and expanded based on the previous Local Government Act, I do want to flag two limitations or caveats in relation to these powers. First, in relation to development cost charges, the services that are used to calculate a development cost charge may not be made a condition of land development unless the owner voluntarily agrees to provide that service themselves. Second, a local government cannot use the powers under this provision to allow the development of lands that is below the density of the applicable zoning. So any requirements here must be in line with the zoning requirements and the density therein. Moving on to our second realm, the legislation has broadened the ability of an approving officer to require land without compensation for transit purposes. So as a reminder, before Bill 16, an approving officer could require a subdividing landowner to dedicate a portion of the land as highway without compensation as a condition of approval of a subdivision. Bill 16 has broadened the ability to require land without compensation to both the subdivision stage and to the stage of the issuance of the building permit. Further, the uses for which the land can be taken without compensation has been expanded. So in relation to subdivision, and in addition to requiring land for highway purposes, an approving officer can now require that the landowner provide land without compensation up to 5 meters in depth for the purposes of constructing and installing sustainable design features and transportation on the lands. As I mentioned in the last slide, transportation now includes walking, biking, or public transit infrastructure. This is in addition to land. I just want to flag again that this is in addition to the requirement to require lands as a condition. Sorry, this is in addition to the requirement to require land be dedicated as highway during the subdivision stage. So the same entitlements to land for greener transit infrastructure also exists at the building permit stage. But interestingly, it's not the approving officer who makes this determination. Instead, the local government may appoint a servicing officer to make this requirement on the landowner. If you remember from the definition slide earlier in the presentation, a servicing officer is a new term created by the legislation. For your reference, servicing officer is not actually defined in the legislation, but instead Bill 16 states that a local government may, by bylaw, designate a servicing officer from a prescribed class of persons. The prescribed class of persons that a servicing officer can be chosen from will be provided at a later date by regulation. So all of this to say, a local government cannot yet appoint a servicing officer and therefore cannot yet take advantage of these new entitlements. But once the regulation is released, this should become possible. Continuing on with the theme of greener transit, a local government can now require certain transportation demand management measures, or TDM measures, as a condition of building permit approval. So happily, the legislation actually provides a definition for transportation demand management, or TDM. I have the definition on the slide, but for certainty, TDM is defined as improving the movement of people or goods, reducing motor vehicle dependence, and increasing sustainable transportation through measures including electric vehicle chargers, end-of-trip facilities, and scooter and bicycle parking. To advance its plans for TDM, a local government can require that the owners or occupiers of any land or building or structure that are seeking a building permit provide greener transit mesh features to a specific design standard. Alternatively, the developer and the local government can agree to the developer paying more money instead of meeting that standard. The money paid by the developer must be equal to the estimated costs that the developer would otherwise incur if they were going to provide the TDM measures. These costs must include the estimated planning, engineering, legal, and interest costs. Any funds received by the local government, instead of having the TDM measures implemented on the ground, must be deposited into a reserve fund devoted to that purpose. On June 30th of each year, the local government who has received these funds must prepare a reserve fund report that outlines the amounts received in the reserve fund, the expenditures made, the total balance, and the timeline for future projects using these funds. This report must be made available to the public. Okay, I'm pleased to announce that we are through what I think is the densest section of the presentation. We are turning now to the third realm of change, specifically to the new ability of a municipality to enact tenant protection bylaws. So under Section 8 and the new Section 63 sub G of the Community Charter, Council may make bylaws under their health and safety of persons and property power. In relation to tenant protection, these powers will be triggered when a property is being developed, redeveloped, or proposed to redevelopment, and that property has tenants on it. I pause here to note again that redevelopment is defined in the legislation. The definition is quite lengthy, and I won't bore you all by reading it verbatim, but to largely and roughly summarize, redevelopment refers to the demolition of a residential property for the purpose of new construction on the same site if that new construction would have the result of the complete and irreversible destruction of a tenant's living accommodation, common areas, or amenities to which they have rights of access. If the landlord proposes or is going to redevelop the property in accordance with this definition, then the municipality may, by bylaw, require the landlord to provide the tenant with any or all of the following: notices or information with respect to the redevelopment. This would allow the tenant to be more aware of what's happening in the timeline for such. They can require that the owner provide financial compensation for the termination of a tenancy agreement. If they do so, the bylaw must define the nature of financial assistance and both when and how it will be dispersed to the tenant. They can require that the landlord provide financial or other assistance to the tenant in relation to finding and relocating to a comparable unit. If the bylaw authorizes this power, then it must state what comparable means, probably through providing a definition. They also provide that the landowner may enter into agreements with the tenant to provide a comparable unit on property that the landowner has an interest in. For example, if they own another apartment building. This can also include a requirement that the owner rent the redeveloped unit back to the tenant in priority of other persons and at a rate less than provided under the applicable zoning bylaws and housing agreements. So these are pretty broad powers, and they can be used to provide a much greater scope of protection to tenants, especially in light of the SMA regulations and how there may be increased redevelopment within your municipalities and regional districts. I do want to note that despite the broad scope of these new powers, there is an important caveat relating to the requirement specifically for financial assistance by the landowner, and a caveat for these powers more generally. In relation to financial assistance, I note that if the tenant is already to be compensated under the Residential Tenancy Act, then the amount that the owner is required to pay by bylaw will be reduced by the Residential Tenancy Act amount. So for example, if the bylaw states that the tenant is to receive $500 and the Residential Tenancy Act states that they are already owed $250, then the $500 amount will be reduced by $250. That is, the tenant can't double collect off of the RTA amount and the bylaw amount. As for the more general caveat, I want to note that these powers may only be exercised when the tenancy agreement is terminated due to proposed redevelopment or an actual redevelopment. In other words, the tenant protection bylaws provided in Bill 16 cannot require that the landowner compensate the tenant for the termination of a tenancy agreement due to other reasons. There may be subsequent legislation coming down the pipes that will address this, but not in relation to my presentation, Bill 16 does not provide these additional powers. So moving forward to our fourth realm, we have the new density bonusing schemes provided by Bill 16. So for background, before Bill 16, the Local Government Act enabled local governments to establish density rules in their zoning bylaws. The Act now sets out a more comprehensive scheme for density rules and allows municipalities to grant density bonuses in exchange for either the provision of amenities or for the provision of affordable or special needs housing. And for reference, that kind of annoying acronym A/SNH on the slide, that refers to affordable and special needs housing. So in relation to density bonusing schemes, there's two new definitions to be aware of. The first, the conditional density rule, means a density regulation that applies to a certain zone if certain conditions are met. In other words, if certain conditions are met in relation to the land, then the zone is entitled to a certain, often higher density. The second definition, density benefit zoning bylaw, is one of those definitions that is defined through cross-reference to another section of the Act. However, this is essentially a zoning bylaw that authorizes a higher density if the development provides for affordable or special needs housing. An interesting thing about the new density bonusing scheme is that the density bonus for an affordable housing must be greater than the density bonusing schemes provided by the zoning bylaw. It seems clear to me that the motive here is for the developer to gain the most density possible under a zoning bylaw. If the developer wants to gain the most density possible under a bylaw, then they must be willing to provide affordable or special needs housing to the community. So we are at the fifth and final realm of change. This realm is inclusionary zoning, which is one of the biggest buzzwords to come out of Bill 16, and it's what I will mostly spend the rest of my presentation discussing. Inclusionary zoning is essentially referring to requiring affordable and special needs housing in new developments, and the new legislation aims to achieve this goal through a combination of tools. As you can see on the slide, local governments may promote inclusionary zoning in one of two ways. First, they can utilize the density bonusing rules that we just discussed to incentivize developers to include more affordable and special needs housing by leveraging increased density in exchange. I would refer to this as the carrot approach. The second option is to mandate that any new development that is in whole or in part a residential development must have a certain number of affordable housing units. This is more akin to the stick approach. So I do want to flag that the ability to adopt an inclusionary zoning bylaw is discretionary. So that is, a local government can choose whether to adopt these bylaws, and if they do so, they can use either the stick, the carrot, both, or neither. However, if they do choose to exercise that discretion and to adopt an inclusionary zoning bylaw that mandates affordable housing units be developed, then that bylaw must include certain information. So, as I said, if the local government chooses to adopt an affordability and special needs housing bylaw, then the bylaw itself must establish the following requirements. It must state the form of tenure of the affordable housing units, the affordability of the units themselves, including both the sale price or the rental charge for the unit, the length of time that the affordability requirement will apply. Is it 5 months, 5 years, 20 years? And a formula for calculating the capital cost that a developer would incur in order to provide that unit. While the bylaw must include all of this information and it's mandatory, local governments still retain discretion to impose different conditions for different properties. And these conditions can vary based on the area, the tenure, the construction material, and so on. It's just required that any differences be set out by the bylaw. In addition to these mandatory requirements for specific affordable special needs housing units, the bylaw must also more generally identify the portion of the development or the percentage of the development that will be consisting of affordable units. So in other words, if you have a development, you must state either every 5 units out of 20 will be affordable housing or the percentage. So this portion may be identified as either a number in relation to all housing units on the development or as a percentage of the gross floor area of the residential component of the development, keeping in mind that since the definition here is affordable housing units can be required for any development that is in whole or in part residential. This may include a mixed residential commercial use, for example. So although we just discussed that the bylaw can mandate that the development include a certain number of affordable housing units, the legislation does recognize that such an approach may not be feasible for each and every development. So in order to provide some flexibility, Bill 16 provides that if a bylaw for affordable housing is adopted, the developer can meet their obligations in one of three ways. First, and as discussed, they can simply provide the prescribed number of affordable units in the development. Second, they can opt to provide the affordable or special needs housing units as a separate development on other lands owned by the developer. And third, they can opt out of providing the units entirely and instead provide a payment in lieu. If the developer takes the second or third options, then there are additional steps and restrictions to keep in mind. So in relation to the second option of providing the affordable housing units elsewhere on other land, there are a few requirements that must be met. First, the local government must agree to this and enter into an agreement with the developer that sets out the proposed development for these units. The proposal and the agreement must meet or exceed the original conditions proposed by the bylaw. And further, the agreement must set out the following classic who, what, where, when, why information. So where will on which parcel or parcels of land will each of the units be located? Who is to provide the units on each parcel of land? What is the timeline for providing these units? How will the units meet or exceed the bylaw requirements? And also, these agreements must include any other information prescribed by regulation, which we don't have at this point. So this may be an option to secure affordable or special needs housing when the development itself being proposed would not reasonably accommodate this type of housing. Now, let's say the developer is unable to provide the units on the new development and does not have any additional lands to put the units on instead, or simply doesn't have a proposal that the city or regional district or other local government thinks is reasonable. There is a third option. The developer can pay their way out of providing the affordable or special needs housing units. More specifically, the owner can pay capital costs to the local government. The capital costs definition is on the slide, and I note that it includes the planning costs, engineering costs, legal costs, and interest costs associated with providing, constructing, altering, or expanding affordable and special needs housing units. This is a general definition, and the legislation further requires that the affordable housing bylaw provide a formula to assist the local government in calculating the capital cost amount. As for timing of payment, the payment is due at the issuance of the building permit. Once the funds are paid, they must be deposited into a reserve fund for prescribed affordable and special needs housing unit purposes. In an annual report due on June 30th, the local government must review the total amount of money paid into this reserve fund and paid in lieu of providing affordable housing, any expenditures coming out of that reserve fund, and the total remaining balance in the accounts. Similar to the Transit Demand Management Report, this report must be made available to the public. So, your local government is sold on adopting an affordable and special needs housing unit bylaw and understand what goes in it. However, there are a few steps that must be taken before adoption and a few exemptions to the legislation that you should be aware of. So first, before adopting or amending an affordable special needs housing bylaw, the local government must consult with persons, public authorities, and organizations prior to the adoption or amendment. Council is the party that will decide whether an entity is affected by the density benefit zoning bylaw or the housing bylaw. The legislation does create an option for the province through the lieutenant governor and council to make regulations that prescribe consultation processes or make exceptions for the consultation requirements. However, as I've mentioned before, we don't have those regulations at this time. Second, the local government must conduct a feasibility analysis. This requires the local government to again consult with the affected persons prior to the adoption or amendment of the bylaw, and for the local government to consider the following factors: local housing conditions, residential construction costs, amenities, required density, and transportation. This analysis must also be made available to the public upon request. So third, the inclusionary zoning bylaw must provide for greater density than the minimum density for TOAs or other analogous areas. I've already discussed the fourth and fifth requirement in some detail, namely that the bylaw must include specific information about the units themselves, and they must specify what portion or proportion of the development will be affordable. And finally, I do want to flag that these requirements only apply to the adoption or amendment of a bylaw and not to the repeal of a bylaw. So keep that in mind. And finally, I want to note that certain corporations are exempt from affordable and special needs housing bylaw requirements. So I have these on the screen, but just as a brief summary, these exempt corporations include a corporation that is incorporated by or in which shares have been acquired by a municipality or a regional district for purposes that include providing affordable housing. It also includes societies, although if you have a society under the Society Act, they are exempt unless they are a member-funded society, a board under the Health Authorities Act, an agent of the government or the Government of Canada, a registered charity under Section 248 of the Income Tax Act, and other prescribed bodies that the province may add in by regulation. I also want to note that precursor applications are not subject to these requirements. There's a couple definitions for a precursor application in the legislation, but generally you consider these to be an in-stream building permit application that has been submitted to a local government in a satisfactory form, and the applicable fees have been paid. If you have an application of this nature, then it should be processed under the pre-Bill 16 legislation. So that concludes my summary of Bill 16. Thank you all for staying with me. As Sophie mentioned, we will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, but I also have included my email on the slide, and I welcome you to send me any questions you may have. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sophie.
Great. Thank you, Katy, for providing that comprehensive overview of the new legislation as it relates to affordable housing. Lots of good information there. And for people watching today, please know that we will be sending out the slide presentation and a recording of the presentation as well. So if you get overwhelmed, not to worry, you'll have all of the information at a later date. Okay. So now moving on to the next portion, the practical portion of our presentation, I would like to ask Katy Fabris and Kaela Schramm to turn on their webcams, and they're both welcome to come up at the same time. And you're ready to go. So Kaela, will you be starting?
Yes.
Or okay?
I'll start us off. Thanks, Sophie.
Excellent.
And thanks, Katy, for your while the legal overview can be a little bit dry, I think all of us actually do find that quite interesting, and it was very thorough. So thank you very much. So we are going to talk a little bit about affordable housing and sort of the practical application, running through some of the impacts of some of these decisions, including some of our wish list as different planners are thinking about working through with your councils and your government some of these changes. I did want to start off by acknowledging that I myself am in Trail, so I am on the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Syilx nations. So just happen to be here today. Katy is on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, Shwepsum, and Wasanix speaking people. So we'll get started. Quick overview of who we are. We'll talk a little bit about non-market housing and affordability, and I think we all know that's difficult to define, which is why it's in quotations. We'll talk a little bit about developing non-market housing, development viability, and then that wish list. So just a little bit about us. We are a professional consulting firm. That includes planners, development consultants, project managers, and nonprofit housing experts. We have over 30 years of experience doing both market and non-market housing, and have partnered with all levels of government. We do work across the province, so we bring that provincial lens, and we work in smaller communities as well as the Victoria, Vancouver, Kelownas. We will attempt to try and address sort of that range as we move through our presentation. We have a fully Indigenous board of directors and focus on sort of that researching, development, and operations. This is our full sort of suite of services. So everything from community planning. We did take on a number of the housing needs assessments in that first round, doing some updates now, housing action plans, all the way through to the development and helping with some operations planning for not-for-profits developing affordable housing. So as I said, province-wide, managing close to $2 billion in project costs, which is represents over 4,500 new homes. So when we talk about defining affordability, how do we define it? There is no one global definition that can be agreed upon. And oftentimes what we find in our work is there are different bodies that we're working with, different regulators, different funders that are defining affordability differently. Building BC defines affordability differently than CMHC's Affordable Housing Fund, for example. It does commonly refer to low to moderate income earners. And oftentimes the CMHC market rental data is utilized to inform some of the affordability metrics that we work with when we lever government funding to create non-market housing. So how do we understand affordability? So there is shelter rate. So that would be the, as defined by the BC Ministry of Employment and Assistance. That number just went up last year. There's the BC Housing Income Limits. And so that sort of sets the upper end of what a household can make. It actually means that's what you have to be under that income limit to actually get onto the BC Housing Registry, which is the process for accessing the bulk of the affordable housing units in the province. Not all, but the bulk. It can be a percentage of average market rent. It can be rent geared to income. Rent geared to income typically requires a lot of paperwork and assessment to understand a household's assets, income, and then rent is calculated based on all of that information to be set at a maximum of 30% of that income. There is median market rent as reported by CMHC Housing Market, and there's also average market rent. BC Housing tends to like using the average. CMHC likes to use the median, so that's not always the same. But most importantly, we just wanted to underscore that affordability is often community defined and informed by place-based specific needs and demands. So when we talk about small communities like the one that I'm in, Trail, communities under 10,000 don't have access to, for example, to CMHC rental data. So often have to look at some other indicators in order to sort of define what sort of the average cost of housing is in that community. So commonly used affordability definitions, core housing need, missing middle is out there. I mentioned the housing income limits, the shelter rate portion of income assistance. BC Builds looks at middle income earners. So that's 20% of the units for that program are rented at 20% below market rent for a minimum of 35 years. So you can start to see how if a municipality starts to layer in a definition, that starts to get a little complicated. CMHC, under their national housing strategy, and So the Affordable Housing Fund, previously referred to, the previous name was co-investment. So if that sounds more familiar, it's that fund. They're looking for 30% of the units to have rents at less than 80% of median market rents for at least 20 years. And then there are some of the other pieces. UN Habitat has a little bit more nuance to theirs, and then the different local governments, some local governments have definitions or are looking to provide definitions when working with affordable housing providers. So we thought it might be interesting. Yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I was just gonna jump in, but feel free to jump in too, Kaela. We took sort of like, we thought it'd be interesting to look at like what affordability means to a sample family. Like, what does this look in BC? So we took a look at Nanaimo. This is Jackie and Francis and their family. And we put, so we were able to look up the median income for Nanaimo. The latest data we could find was 2019, so that's $75,500. This family would need a 3-bedroom unit based on the national occupancy standards, which to affordable housing providers kind of dictate who they can offer units to based on unit mix. So we thought it'd be kind of interesting to look at like what can they afford under different options versus what is available under these. So I think one of the affordability definitions that we often hear about, and it ties to sort of what BC Housing puts forward as a rent geared to income model, is about 30% of a household's before tax income going towards their rent. This comes from like some 19th century studies that identified sort of this concept of like a week's wage for a month's rent. That's sort of where those pieces come from. So looking at that, the rent that they would have or the money that they would have set for rent would be $1,888. So in Nanaimo, looking at the statistics that CMHC provides for under their housing market information portal, these are the median rents in Nanaimo. And then a reminder that 30% of Jackie and Francis's income is $1,888. So a 2-bedroom unit is more than 30% of their income. So under these sort of options, they could spend less than 30% of their income on housing and be severely overcrowded. They could still be overcrowded and have a 2-bedroom and make the choice to start spending a little more than that 30% sort of threshold that we talk about, or to find a suitable unit, like a 3-bedroom, they would be looking at spending nearly 40% of their income. And there was a comment here that noted that CMHC median rents are on the low side, and that
Absolutely.
is definitely true. And I'm sure anyone in Nanaimo would note that as well, that those would be very reasonably.
I was going to mention that that's all, because it's an average. It's all of the units that exist in a community. Some of the older, what is often naturally occurring affordable housing, mixed in with the new stock, which is usually not.
And sort of another piece to tie to this is that this also assumes that they're able to find a 3-bedroom unit. Family units often have very low vacancy, and sometimes that drives the cost of them up even more. So we also took a look at like what rent could they get if some of these affordable housing programs were implemented in their community through different programs, and there's lots going on in Nanaimo, so there are probably units that qualify and meet under these categories. They might be few and far between in terms of their availability, but under CMHC's Affordable Housing Fund, theoretically a 3-bedroom unit in Nanaimo could be available for under $1,200, which is nicely below that 30% income, which would probably be wonderful for Jackie Francis and their family. BC Housing's funding program would be a little bit different. It would put them closer to this 1,888 marker, but still at 30% of their income. And what's nice about that RGI housing number is that it would fluctuate with their income. So if one of them were to be in a situation where they had less income coming in annually, they could income test for lower rent. So that's kind of a piece that's interesting there. Okay.
So one of the things we wanted to put forward to this group of folks attending this webinar is I think there is enough housing and affordable housing projects, non-market housing projects happening in your communities that we want to encourage municipalities to start thinking about the types of housing applications coming through in two different streams, because they are quite different. So sort of a market stream, which might be an inclusionary zoning stream, it might be something where you're needing to secure that rental and it's coming from a traditional developer who is either carrot or stick providing that affordable or housing. And then you've got housing applications from that are non-market housing that are not for profit owned, that have a senior government funder attached to them. And when these properties or perhaps a larger airspace parcel or component are owned by non-market, there's already a large number of um, funding sort of commitments and pressures on having the rental units being defined in a very specific way, where adding another layer to coordinate can become complicated. And I think we'll continue to kind of flow through, but that's the seed that we want to plant. So market affordable housing could be market, non-market owned or rented, but is usually developed and constructed by a for-profit developer, builder, or individual homeowner. This would be typically where households spending less than 30% of their pre-tax income on adequate shelter are categorized as households accessing affordable housing. Versus, right, so then in this particular stream, the role of local government we see as being a little bit different. So this is where you want to have your housing agreement there to secure that affordability as part of that development process, where perhaps that definition of affordability is critical, that, you know, there is that role of the permitting process and the speed by which permits are granted feeds into that process. There's still that opportunity to provide contributions in the form of grants, fees, development cost waivers, all of those things that we appreciate that help encourage purpose-built rental housing, some of which might be affordable.
I think this is sort of the stream that falls into a lot of what Katie was talking about. A lot of those
Yes.
Bill 16 carrots and sticks are in that category.
Yeah, exactly. We do want to leave space. Sometimes market developers will partner with a not-for-profit who ends up owning a component of the development, and I do think that that's a little different. So then when we talk about non-market housing, in most cases, you know, identical to market rental housing in terms of the planning and development process, the significant difference is the cost of rent at the end, often subsidized through a large grant contribution or ongoing operating subsidies by a senior government. And then there's sort of that owned or leased, that sort of ownership component is with the not-for-profit with that senior government funder. And therefore that affordability is dictated by that senior government funder. So when we kind of look at some of the different levers in this one, or I guess wheels, oftentimes in the role of local government, land is an opportunity for a contribution. So being able to identify and leverage city-owned land for non-market housing is critical. It helps increase the ability to offer lower rents because you've now eliminated one of your major cost drivers. There are still oftentimes housing agreements that happen in this scenario with us. What we find is we spend a lot of time and effort negotiating housing agreements, and we just wanted to plant the seed. What is the purpose of the housing agreement? If it's to secure affordable housing, there are already a pile of agreements and encumbrances on title securing that affordability. And oftentimes housing agreements we have to make significant adjustments to make sure that they don't conflict with the agreements already committed to by those senior levels of government. There is still a huge opportunity to streamline and expedite permitting processes, which is critical. Time is money, and that contribution in the form of grants, fees, development cost charge waivers, all of the things, any cost pressures that can be relieved. Sometimes the dollar figure isn't significant, but it is, I think, important to note. And when I say it isn't significant, is when your senior government funder is bringing $15 million to the table and you're bringing $200,000 to the table, that's not on the same level. However, having that senior government funder see that commitment from a municipality, oftentimes just that commitment is enough to sometimes put those applications over the top when we're competing for funding, and you want it to be awarded to your community. So I think we wanted to note that we need more market and non-market housing. We're in a supply challenge issue. So because the cost of land and materials and labor is so high, the profitability margins, new housing, you don't have to say market, anything that's built new is not going to be affordable on its own. We're looking at most of our communities, we're at nearly $500 a square foot if we're lucky. We have a lovely, and in this money example, we have a lovely example of two projects. Both have surface parking and were 3 stories, wood frame, so kind of similar constructability. Ended up a year apart from each other in tendering, and there was a $40 a square foot difference in that 1 year. Kind of all other factors mostly being the same. So that's the kind of escalation that we have been seeing over many years, kind of since COVID really hit us hard. So it's a huge investment, and so most market-oriented developers do need to see returns in addition to dealing with those high costs. And so in reality, the only way to maintain or achieve affordable housing is through those provincial or federal programs. Sometimes they're just as simple as preferred financing that can help achieve a little bit of affordability. But in a lot of communities, the level deeply affordable or even just something moderately affordable requires a surprisingly significant investment. So yeah, and more units reduce the competition, but rarely reduce the costs. And we wanted to underscore that non-market units actually reduce costs in the marketplace. So when supporting these projects do actually help on multiple levels. Katie?
Oh, I was just going to say, we've talked about a lot of these pieces, but I think sort of to summarize those parts, like there's tremendous variance within the non-market housing sector. There's lots of definitions of affordability. There's varying degrees of what affordability looks like. And I think that captured in the Bill 16 legislation, even by the name of that, like affordable and special needs housing, like it can be everywhere from shelter to like 10% below market, right? It's so many things. And I think another piece that we want to underscore is there are providers in communities that you all live and work in that might have a specific lens on affordable housing in their community. So you could have providers who specialize in women's housing or specialize in that just below market versus supportive housing. But I think what's a common element in all of these non-market components that we're talking about is that they're nonprofit owned, they're supported by other levels of government, and this affordability is secured through a legal agreement with the funder. And yeah, therefore they are in fact affordable in perpetuity.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to also cover a little bit of the developing, the process of developing non-market housing. Just kind of going through some of these pieces to just sort of show what it takes to sort of line some of these projects up. So in British Columbia, non-market housing is delivered through partnerships. A not-for-profit cannot just will it into place. But they do play a really key role in sort of operating that non-market housing. Probably important to underscore to this audience, when you look at a CMHC or BC Housing as a major funder, the majority of the weighted points are in the operating section. So you can have a great concept. If you do not have a solid operator, you will not get funding. And CMHC, I think, has a minimum number of years that you have to demonstrate operational experience. So the key players are those providing capital and operating funds. So that's the BC Housings, that's the CMHCs. We have our advocacy and support sector. So the BC Not-for-Profit Housing Association and the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. We have our operators, as I mentioned, and development consultants. Developing affordable housing is becoming increasingly complex. And so not-for-profits are hiring experts in development, but also in navigating the funding landscape of senior funders, in development consultants. And then there's the local government component, which I think, we've seen an increase in local government participation and being kind of a critical component in this sort of partnership landscape over the years. And local governments can be, a partner, a facilitator, bringing land to the table as a funder, affordable housing funds, waiving DCCs. We'll put that in as a cost and as an equity contribution in our budgets to demonstrate that monetary commitment, even when there's waivers allowed by right. Local governments can be developers and operators in some situations. So another piece we wanted to talk about, Katie, I don't know if you want to run through this one. It's just, what does the development process look like? What are the stages?
Yeah, we really wanted to just show this because I think I've worked in local government myself, and sort of coming into this part of the affordable housing development component, and seeing sort of everything that happens start to finish, it sort of pushes forward. It really emphasizes the amount of time and the work that it takes to put non-market housing or housing in general forward. And I think part of it is that it takes a long time. So those municipal processes are just a critical component, or a component of the larger scale of what has to happen. We've also identified some of these blue that are the gateposts that a senior funder would put forward, just to sort of give a sense of how early the municipal processes really end up being in this overall process of securing dollars and moving things forward. So a nonprofit can be taking on a lot of risk in this process, in order to move a project forward.
So as we mentioned, there are a number of funders. Some of the kind of most the larger programs that are funding the largest number of projects that we're sort of seeing across the province includes the Community Housing Fund and the Indigenous Housing Fund, which does fund projects both on and off reserve or treaty lands. That includes the capital contribution. There are set rent levels with that low to moderate income target, that there is 20% that is deeply affordable, that shelter rate portion of income assistance. There is an ongoing subsidy attached, and that is secured for 60 years, and low interest financing. Something like a BC Builds that I think probably many of you have noticed is a very new program. That one has a different model. There is a capital contribution to buy down the cost to achieve about 20% of the units to be at about 20% below market, which are secured for 35 years. And there's access to low interest financing, really targeting those middle income earners. As we said earlier, it's hard to build anything new and even be able to make that attainable for those middle income earners. We have CMHC, who has low interest financing and extended amortization terms up to 50 years. And if you meet some of their criteria, which is affordability, energy efficiency, those types of criteria, then they do have capital contributions that scale as you hit some of those different criteria. You can increase your contribution.
We also thought it might be useful to just sort of see what that contribution looks like. So like on a 40-unit building under one of those community housing and indigenous housing fund, that could be a capital contribution of $6.5 million under the community housing fund, in addition to an ongoing mortgage subsidy that could range really anywhere, but most of the ones that we're seeing are between $800 and $1,500 per unit per month. So that's a pretty significant both capital contribution and then long-term ongoing. So under IHF, there's deeper affordability, so there's a higher capital cost of $15 million.
And you may note that that ongoing subsidy has a similar range. That's because it does include, this would be the average that we're seeing in a lot of our projects. That does include on reserve communities that are a little bit more rural and remote, and might have a little bit of a cost premium for constructing where they are.
And then BC Builds, that 40-unit building, that program's a little different. It's not necessarily specifically on a per unit basis, but that could look like up to $9 million in contribution, or through CMHC's Affordable Housing Fund. Depending on the level of affordability, it could be upwards of $3 million in addition to extended amortization. So the contribution is pretty significant, is what we're getting at.
But it is kind of nice to see how the differences of those projects, like what that contribution actually looks like, right? So now the strings. There are strings attached to that contribution. So I think, as we've mentioned before, there's operating agreements which secure the affordability for 60 years. There's an associated covenant restricting redevelopment, assigning rents, and there's an option to purchase from BC Housing, where if in the outside chance a not-for-profit is not able to continue operating that unit, the building as intended, BC Housing will step in and ensure that it does. BC Builds also use restrictive covenants to keep the affordability for the life of the mortgage, and CMHC does the same. And it's fun when you have both. You get to figure out who wants to take first position and who wants to take second position.
And then I guess we wanted to just alert you to some of the other strings that come in addition with those legal strings. Both funders would put forward design guidelines, requirements for multiple levels of review. They review everything down to your mechanical system. There's reporting requirements, there's minimums for accessibility, there's energy efficiency requirements. Something that's kind of interesting is that often these provincial programs, because of provincial mandates, will often be on sort of the leading edge of many new technologies or new energy efficiency requirements. So you might see the adoption of the Energy Step Code as a requirement to BC Housing funded buildings was much earlier than it was sort of rolled out to the rest of projects across the province. And then in addition to that, the other sort of string that makes it hard or fun is that there's limited access to capital dollars to advance your project before construction starts. And this is something that before this webinar, we were talking through with a few staff in the office, but like, what's one thing you really wish that the local government knew? It's that you just don't have a lot of money to pay deposits and bonding and securities until everything is secured, like until you really get to that finalizing your building permit stage.
So development viability. So we'll run through some dollars and cents here. We've used an example of a project that is now open and operational. It's 170 units on Drennan Street in Souk. There's a mix of 1s, 2s, and 3s, specifically targeting Indigenous individuals and families. It was funded under a grant-only program, so there was a capital contribution, a total of $57 million in cost. So our role was to act as that development consultant and move that project through the approvals processes, get the funding secured, hire everybody, and get that building built. So how rents are set. Again, keep in mind this is a non-subsidized project. So once the costs are the costs, we got to figure out how to debt service that mortgage. So we did get a $14.5 million contribution through that funding program. The society also contributed $1.5 million, and we got CMHC to come to the table with 16.9, which left us with a $3.1 million mortgage.
On that society
Yeah, go ahead.
contribution, it's probably really important to note that not all societies are able
That does
to put
not.
in that kind of money. Most societies are not, in fact. And I think in this situation, the society saw what the average rent was looking like and made the executive decision to put capital into this project to better serve their tenants. So that was should not be unexpected.
Yeah, agreed. It's a good note. Yes, most of our societies do not have, they don't have extra cash to get things moving along. So then they're dependent on the seed fundings and the project development fundings from funders, even just to get a project started. So operating costs, what does that mean? So just to keep the slide simple, that's $1,173 in just across all unit types. Obviously, we have different rents for our 1 beds from our 3 beds, but you can kind of see where that it's not too bad. But that was sort of where we hit on average with that capital contribution. But you can imagine there are just definitely still households that are going to be incapable of affording that rent. But that is how the dollars went with this. We do have our operating costs in there, which show what the per unit per month, which is a typical metric used in the non-market development world. What those mortgage payments were with a net 10% cash flow, so not having a little bit of extra. So we wanted to show local government impact. So I kind of mentioned like, a capital contribution of $265,000 a door.
Total.
It is helpful. But you can see that brings the average rent down by about $20 per unit per month. So that is a useful contribution, but you can see that the significant level of affordability is coming from those senior funders. But we also wanted to highlight that not all contributions are equal, and that some of the other ways in which municipalities can contribute can actually impact significantly more. So when we look at a one-time capital contribution versus the property tax exemption, that is an ongoing reduction in rents of almost $70 per unit per month, which you can start to see brings that average rent down. When we also look at that on a monthly basis, that's $12,000 a month. So if we also look at that across 170 units, sure, it's almost $70, which is, a week's worth of groceries. It's impactful for a family. A not-for-profit could also take those dollars and significantly reduce the rents of like maybe 10 to 15 units rather than spread across and do that $60 per unit per month. So now we're talking about maybe some of the units stay at that that average of 1173, and you might get 10 to 15 that are able to start to drop down into the like $700 or $800 a month, and now you're starting to see that impact.
We've got another project here, which is a really lovely story. Like everything about this project is lovely. It's in Kamloops. I think just because we don't have a ton of time and I want to make sure there's time for questions, I won't talk too much in detail, but feel free to reach out. There's a lot of really good information on this project online. It's a huge partnership project, but one of the big things that this project demonstrated, the city was able to come forward with the land and some contribution. And ultimately, when this project happened, just as the National Housing Strategies Co-Investment Fund was coming out, one of the things that was kind of interesting was the co-investment fund was actually able to fill the gap, which immediately brought the rents down from being $560 to $675 to hitting what at the time was shelter rates of $375 per unit per month. And that was really impactful on this project, which specifically targeted youth aging out of care and elders. So people who likely would have been on social assistance, and that 560 would have been a stretch. So just sort of the impact of some of those critical pieces. So with all that said, we just thought we'd bring forward a bit of a wish list or some things that we'd hope that as you do some of this work to implement this new legislation as local governments, you're thinking through specifically in the context of non-market housing. So one of the big ones is that funders like clarity. So when trying to secure non-market housing in your community, thinking through how we can demonstrate to a funder that something is not a risk. So in our we sort of feel like bylaw is greater than application. So parking maximums, variances, things that are in there by right make a huge difference to a funder if you're trying to attract affordable housing and financial contribution into your community. Another piece around there is that nonprofits don't have a lot of cash typically just sitting around. They're mission driven and nonprofit. So early dollars from funders are limited. So if there's ways that municipalities can develop their own preliminary development fundings, I know that's something that sort of some of those half dollars have been going towards. I know there's some communities in the Okanagan that are piloting some similar programs. Those can go a long way. Waiving or deferring fees is another thing.
Until building permit, because you can do that now.
Yeah.
That's key.
That one that can make a big difference. And I think just the key piece is like, what does the municipality really need to make a decision at this point? How does this align? That's a key piece that we wanted to stress. We were talking about some of the things on that nonprofits don't have a lot of cash piece the other day, and we had a community along the coast that actually amended their development procedures bylaw to allow a different way of securities to be paid that didn't impact our ability as a project to put cash out. So instead of needing to put a giant letter of credit down, which impacted the society's cash flow, and we would have had to carry interest through our entire project, which would have immediately impacted the rent in the building, we were able to provide a letter of guarantee from BC Housing that sort of said, don't worry, we've got your landscaping and paving deposit, it's covered off. And we were able to do that, and that was a huge saver on rents. So some of those creative pieces made a big difference.
I might say with the bylaw versus application, just to further reemphasize that point, if we're putting an application in for BC Housing to fund a project, and we have to apply for a property tax exemption, or we have to apply for a DCC waiver, we actually have to assume that we pay that cost in our project when we're putting it in. So it doesn't matter that we have that opportunity to, and it therefore makes our project less competitive and less viable compared to others where perhaps that is not the case. Thought that might be helpful. And then putting housing agreements into place. So kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, being thoughtful if you are defining affordability. And I know that is a requirement. One of the things that Katie and I were kind of thinking about is if your project is not for profit owned and there is a senior funder committed, does that meet the definition of affordability? Does that sort of fulfill the requirement? Yeah. That would be our argument, and then take time to focus on securing those units that are coming through developers and other mechanisms where you do need to make sure that you're guaranteed use and securing that. And yeah, being flexible, knowing that if you do put a housing agreement forward, there will be, negotiations and back and forth. So as clear as we can be from the start would be the best. And as you update your OCPs in your housing needs reports, we wanted to plant the seed. Remember your not-for-profits when you're looking at those areas that you're going to designate for residential development and maybe some higher density. Not-for-profits, figure out where their land base is and include that in your OCP updates. They don't always own land that might come up if you're using sort of algorithms for proximity to X, Y, and Z. Not-for-profits don't own the best land. They can't compete for the best land. They often own stuff that is at the fringes, or it's well located, but it might just not be where you would have expected it. And so including them and making sure that future ability to develop is built into that asset base. And we would extend that beyond just housing providers. A lot of service providers are starting to get into housing because the friendship centers of the world are realizing they serve an urban Indigenous population and housing is the #1 need. So they're starting to move into that category, for example. So thinking about not just the land holdings of your not-for-profit housing societies, but those mission-driven owned lands for that pre-zoning, pre-density, faith-based groups as well. And last but not least, our wish list. Being clear up front, know what you're asking for and what other divisions are asking. For example, the engineering department sometimes is where we find our stuff gets a little stuck. Providing a realistic timeline and endeavor to stick to it, be predictable. If you're a large municipality with a lot of applications, creating a bylaw that prioritizes non-market housing projects would be excellent. Cutting down that timeline is critical. Having that champion internally to help us from start to finish. Again, if there's a lot of departments and there's a lot going on in your municipality, helping those applications navigate that is critical. Those as of rights allowances are critical. Black and white is helpful. Gray makes things harder. Pushing those financial requirements closer to building permit. Like we mentioned, there's a real cash flow impact. We're hoping that you'll approach with curiosity and collaboration. And my last piece is to think a little bit about rapid deployment and incentives that only not-for-profits can access. When we're updating OCPs and zoning and increasing the value of land for residential, if a not-for-profit is purchasing land, they will not be able to compete for that land going forward. So if there is something additional that they can access as a not-for-profit because they will own that property, that will help even as we look forward beyond sort of these OCP and zoning updates. And I think that is it for us. And everyone can ask Katy their technical questions because I think her presentation was excellent.
Great. Thank you, Kaela and Katy. Much appreciated. Please stay on. And I will invite Katy Dakus to come on and we'll go to the Q&A portion of our program. Hi, Katy. Welcome back.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you.
So I'd like to start very quickly with a couple of quick questions. Does the provincial legislation still allow municipalities to charge a per unit affordable housing fee that can go towards the creation of affordable housing options? So Katy Dakus.
Sorry, are you putting that in the chat, Sophie, just so I can see it? That would be really helpful. Or are you able to?
I might. It might be slow doing that. That's why I thought I might just
that's
read
okay.
it. Okay.
Can you read it one more time for me then, please? Of course.
Does that provincial legislation still allow municipalities to charge a per unit affordable housing fee that can go towards the creation of affordable housing options?
Yeah, so I would think of the legislation as adding more tools to the toolbox. It's not taking away from any of the previous rights or tools that local governments had to require affordable housing. So Everything that I said today is just another option. It hasn't taken away any of the existing tools that you have.
Okay, great. Another related question. Can development cost charges be used to capture the cost of utility upgrades in redeveloping neighborhoods? So we're talking about, we're not talking about greenfield development, but redeveloping neighborhoods. Why is there such a reluctance among municipalities to allow latecomer fees?
So that's a little outside the scope of my presentation today. It's a really great question. As for the first part about the DCCs, as I mentioned, the bill hasn't affected the existing rights that our municipalities have to require those. I think I would struggle to speak on the second piece about the reasons why municipalities may not want to use latecomer fees. I think that will really depend on each different city, regional district, and their own priorities. So I don't think I'm in a great place to speak on that today.
Okay, and then another quick question regarding parking requirements. So I think we're all in agreement that it generally is more desirable to have less parking, to provide more parking, and a developer would likely agree with this, not in all situations, and the municipality or the community would probably benefit from this. But what about in situations, for example, in the car-dependent north, given the climate? How can developers make parking affordable? For example, if they have to put four parking spaces on a lot, how can they make that more affordable? And I think Kaela, perhaps you or Katy, Fabris might be able to answer that question.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if the suggestion is that it's required by the bylaw or they want to do it. What I would say, and it's tiny bit controversial, but like in our world, charging for parking is completely reasonable because when people are making decisions around costs of housing, if you're using the whole building to subsidize building parking and somebody has chosen to not pay for a vehicle as part of their balancing of affordability, having the rent go up because we built parking stalls doesn't feel fair. So we typically try and look at how we can cover the cost of a parking stall through rent. That is tricky in communities that are car dependent, but many of those communities do have buses. We build a lot of our buildings close to bus routes, bike infrastructure, et cetera, even in rural communities.
Okay, so this is a question for Katy. The idea, what is the overwhelming benefit of limited time affordable housing compared to affordable housing in perpetuity? So I guess Katy, Dakus.
I'll take that one. I think that's a great question. And I would suggest reframing that in the sense that this isn't taking away from the ability to have affordable housing in perpetuity. The idea behind the legislation is to add another avenue to increase that housing stock into the communities of affordable housing. I also don't see why just to clarify a little bit, when the bylaw says the timeline for which the affordable housing must remain affordable, that isn't saying it has to be unlimited. You could theoretically have up to in perpetuity affordable housing. It's just saying that you have to designate how long it will be. If it's 5 years, 20 years in perpetuity, you have to address that in your bylaw. So whether the affordable housing under Bill 16 will be in perpetuity or in a limited time duration, I think the goal is just to get housing on the market.
Great, thank you. Question about inclusionary zoning and why it was not made mandatory across BC.
I would love to have a crystal ball so I could go into the province and know exactly why. One analogous scenario that I thought of when I read that question is the public hearing legislation that came down last year. So how that happened is in the past, there was an option for local governments to waive a public hearing requirement. Then after a number of years, it was legislated that they had to waive the public hearing in certain scenarios. So it is possible here that they are rolling out this tool as an option to see how local governments use it, whether it's taken up and any practical limitations. Perhaps in a couple of years or a decade, they will make it mandatory in BC. I don't know. But I did get the sense that the legislation is largely enabling and trying to give flexibility and more tools to local governments. So to me, mandating that this happen across BC isn't consistent with that overarching premise. So my answer would be, I don't know. I think maybe it's to see how this is taken up organically and how local governments can make this tool work for them. But down the road, perhaps it will become mandatory. I don't know.
Mhm.
If I could add something really quickly, I do think some small rural and remote communities don't find that to be an effective tool. So that might be a little bit of that balancing act.
That's a
Mhm.
great point, Kaela.
Yeah. So inclusionary zoning. So we talked about that. How about the option for developers to pay in lieu for affordable housing? It appears that there's no clear requirement. Is that correct, Katy?
Yes, and thank you for flagging this because I would like to clarify. So the legislation makes this a discretionary option. So you can choose to include the payment in lieu in your bylaw or not. And further, if you do include the payment in lieu, the local government can set the standards in the bylaw as to when this is a viable option. So, for example, you could make it a very stringent standard that the owner has to prove to the local government that this isn't a viable alternative. Sorry, let me rephrase that. That the developer has to prove to the local government that providing the units on the development isn't feasible, right? So it's definitely an option. It might be worth having in your bylaw, but if you do include it in your bylaw, make sure the standards are set at a level that your local government is comfortable with to ensure that developers don't simply pay their way out of these requirements.
Great, thank you. Again, for Katy, would capital costs include the actual construction costs for the local government to build affordable housing elsewhere?
So that's a great question. The legislation defines this as the actual costs that the developer would incur in providing the housing. But I do remind you that while capital cost is defined in legislation, the bylaw creates the formula. So when the local government creates this formula, it can ensure that the formula considers the actual on-the-ground costs that would be incurred, and not just perhaps a developer who, says they can do certain construction components for cheaper themselves. It can have a more holistic evaluation of what that cost would be.
Okay, great. Michelle Hoare of the Hey Neighbor Collective has provided a link to some resources. Thank you, Michelle. Winnie, Yip, what is the legislative implications of local governments continue to use negotiated community amenity contributions and not write that into the zoning?
I would harken back to my earlier answer, which is that this legislation is adding tools. So there is, in relation to Bill 16 specifically, there is no legislative implication in continuing with your processes. Bill 16 is just giving you more options to achieve the same goal of adding affordable housing stock.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. Which coastal community amended its procedures bylaw to include the letter of guarantee? And was that your presentation, Katy Dakus?
That was
not me.
Oh,
that was
no?
me, Katy.
Oh, the other
I've
Katy.
I've seen that form of security accepted in a number of communities, whether it was through amending their bylaw or legal opinion saying that it was fine. I've seen it done in Smithers, Gibsons, and Seashell.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Prince
All
George
right.
too. I'll give them a shout out.
Again, Winnie Yip, Katy and all. Section 482.77 says IZ does not apply to, inclusionary zoning does not apply to development wholly owned by societies, co-ops. So would that mean that Bill 16 doesn't have major impact on the current process on market housing development?
That is my understanding. I don't work as much in the non-market housing development side of things, so I might pass that along to Kaela and Katy just to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that would mean that there isn't a major impact on the current process. They'll continue to develop as normally, and there was never typically a requirement for a non-market development to contribute to an affordable fund in any of the projects that we had kind of prior this new bill anyways. So
I think a lot of the time, like the affordable housing was seen as the affordable housing amenity.
exactly.
Okay. Question about Bill 16 and right-of-way for transportation activities. Who's able to tackle that one?
I would probably be best suited.
Okay.
Let me just read it quickly.
Yep.
So I think this is asking if the Bill 16 would prohibit taking additional land beyond the 5 meters for, I'm assuming here that rights of way is not referring to a statutory right of way. I can see Mac is typing. Maybe we'll circle back to that comment. I would just like some clarification on what the right of way is referring to. And then once Mac is in his answer, I could come back to it.
Okay. Is it legally possible to exempt nonprofit housing developments from some or all development permit requirements if specifically mentioned in the guidelines? Who would like to tackle that one? Katy, Dakus?
Yeah, I will take that one. Give me 1 second. I feel like I'm going to say a tentative yes, but I would have to do a little bit more digging into the development permit legislation to confirm. So don't quote me on that. I'm happy to follow up with a response to that, though.
Yeah, thank you, Katy. We appreciate your answers. I can totally understand how difficult this might be to answer legally on the spot, but thank you for your thoughtful answers. So Maggie, thank you for the presentation today. One question for you, Katy Dakus, is does the tenant protection legislation apply to any building with any number of units?
Great question. That is my understanding. As I said, the tenant protection legislation refers to redevelopment of the lands, and it doesn't qualify what the building must be. So if there is a building with tenants on it that is being redeveloped, then the tenant legislation will apply.
Thank you. So Mac has clarified, do we have to apply the 5 meter to an existing road?
No. So the 5 meters can be used the land can be taken up to 5 meters in depth for transit infrastructure. So it doesn't have to be an existing road.
Okay. And on that note, I think we will conclude because we're at 1:33. Any final comments that any of our speakers want to relay? No?
Thanks for attending.
Well, we would like to thank you all for presenting today. Let me just go to our final slide. That was an incredible presentation, very thorough and very dedicated. Thank you, Katy Dakus, Kaela, and Schramm, and Katy Fabris. We appreciate your participation. And for our PIBC members, please remember to log on and record your 1.5 CPL units you've earned today. And if you're a planner, you get 3.0 units for presenting today. So I think that would be Katy Fabris. Thank you all again, and thank you to everybody watching. Again, a very interesting and just a very dense presentation. We will send you out the information so you can take your time in reviewing everything. So we'll say bye for now, and thank you again.